the state of the California market is an unmitigated disaster. I'll just say that. And I think it's important to call that out clearly before we unpack why, because particularly some of the regulators in the state who are suggesting that the environment is more rosy than it is and sometimes misrepresent data to come to that conclusion. I often think about where the US cannabis industry would be if California was performing as it should. If California was performing the way Michigan was, this would be more than a $40 billion industry nationwide.
Kind of the story of New York is a bunch of different stakeholders saying to the decision makers, look at what's happening over on the West Coast. Don't do this, don't do that. Think about this, think about that. And instead of heeding that advice, we're just kind of birds flying into glass windows and they're just going down the path they're going.
Welcome again to the Cannabis Investing Podcast, where we speak with C-level executives, analysts, and sector experts to provide actionable investment insight and the context with which to understand the burgeoning cannabis industry. I'm your host, Rena Sherbal. Welcome, Katie, Neer, and Hirsh Jain to the Cannabis Investing Podcast. Super happy to have you both on the show. So thanks for making the time and coming on.
Of course. So great to be back on, Rena.
Thanks for having me, Rena. It's nice to meet you. Hirsh, I'm excited for today's convo.
Yeah, Katie, welcome to the show. Super happy to have you on. Hirsh, absolutely always a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your insights yet again, and super happy to dive into, if you haven't yet already guessed, Hirsh will be talking cannabis, mostly in California, but honestly, he knows what's going on everywhere. Katie is focused on the New York market and wanted to have them on today because everything's going really well in both places. And I just wanted to congratulate everybody and just kind of do a victory lap. Just kidding. It seems like craziness is afoot more and more every day. So I feel like maybe a good place to start. I think we're going to start with New York just because there's news from there and interest about like what might be happening and what might never happen. So Katie, I'd love if you would kind of give a bit about your background, where you're coming from, and share how you see, kind of start with big picture about what's happening in New York these days.
Oh, where to begin? So just as a little bit of background, I'm a regulatory attorney here in New York that's focused on the cannabis industry. I have worked inside plant touching companies and also in the ancillary cannabis tech space. I've also worked in government here in New York State. So sort of have a 360-degree view of this subject matter. And where we are in New York right now is kind of in the exciting part of implementing the adult use legalization and regulatory law that was passed nearly 3 years ago now. That MRTA is what people call it. So, the regulator's been appointed, they exist, they have adopted final adult use cannabis regulations. They've opened a general licensing application window, which closed about a month ago, and they are in the process of reviewing those applications. And so that next step at a very high level will be to issue adult use licenses, which is really exciting. Now, all of that said, diving into details just a little bit, there is a conditional adult use marketplace that's up and running here in New York because the regulator chose to issue conditional licenses across the supply chain. And that was really their focus for those first 2+ years post legalization. And there's been no shortage of kind of hiccups and litigation issues and any variety of challenges that we could dive into and talk about on that front. But the comprehensive rollout is beginning. We're in the middle of it.
Very good. Very good. I appreciate that overview. Hirsh, you want to dive in where you're coming from and what you're seeing out there on the West Coast?
Sure. When it comes to California, I think there's maybe a few different pieces of this conversation. The first piece is what's going on in California, like what's the state of California cannabis. I think another piece is what are the causes of it? What are the challenges that exist? And maybe the third and final piece is, what is the opportunity to address those challenges? But I'll just start, kind of as Katie did on that first piece, which is like, what is the state of California cannabis? And, on that piece, I'll just say we're about to hit the 8-year anniversary of Prop 64 later this year, right? So it'll be the 8-year anniversary of when Californians voted to legalize cannabis. And, the state of the California market is an unmitigated disaster. I'll just say that. And I think it's important to call that out clearly before we unpack why, because, I think there are some folks, particularly some of the regulators in the state, who are suggesting that the environment is more rosy than it is, and sometimes misrepresent data to come to that conclusion. But here are the facts, right? So the California market has experienced now 12 quarters of decline in total sales. I mean, just to sort of deep dive on that, in the third quarter of 2023, which is the most recent quarter for which we have data, the California market generated 1.25 billion in sales, so about a $5 billion run rate. And that is the lowest total since the second quarter of 2020. And I really think it's important to emphasize that, right? So in the third quarter of 23, it was the lowest total sales in more than 3 years, back to, the second quarter of 2020, which is when COVID, was just kind of kicking off. And so the California market, has just been in a consistent sales decline over the past 3 years. And if we compare California to other states, if we take, say, like Illinois and Michigan, right? If you put those two states together, they're about 20 million people, 22 million people, about half of California. And in December, right, the most recent month for which we have sales data, those two markets together did 480 million in sales. So Michigan did 280 and Illinois did 200. And again, just to emphasize this, these are two states, when put together, are half of California's population, and they did more in sales than California did. California did around 450 million. And these are two states that legalized cannabis after California, often years after California, and therefore are arguably less mature. So I think that data kind of highlights the ways in which the California market is in decline and is underperforming other adult use states. And, maybe just a couple other things I'll say. That's the data on how the market is performing. But, we have seen, particularly over the past year, examples of prominent California cannabis companies collapsing. So Herbal, which was the largest distributor in the state, is now in receivership. A company that was run by someone who had built a very successful business in the alcohol industry. Grassdoor, one of the leading delivery platforms in the state, recently went under. We're long familiar with the fact that a bunch of these MSOs have left the state. But even companies like Forefront, that had one of the most competitive, that was successful in one of the most competitive markets in the country, the state of Washington, unlike the other MSOs, they built this beautiful manufacturing facility, but, because no stores were opening, they left the state. So I think that's a challenge. And I'll just kind of round this out by saying, so sales are in decline. We've seen the departure of a lot of prominent companies run by incredibly talented business people who just can't hack it in this state. But one of the other sort of downstream consequences of that is just the loss of human capital. I know hundreds of profoundly talented people that dedicated their lives to California cannabis, for 5, 6, 7 years, who recently have thrown in the towel. And although that's less tangible than sales data, I think that's really problematic. And I'll just kind of, I'm sure later in this conversation we can unpack why these challenges exist, but I'll just conclude by saying, if we zoom out, I often think about where the US cannabis industry would be if California was performing as it should. If California was performing the way Michigan was, this would be more than a $40 billion industry nationwide. We would have more than 500,000 people working in this industry instead of 400,000. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, the irony is that California, the state that kicked off the medical cannabis movement, is now essentially an anchor on the neck of the U.S. cannabis industry, both in terms of its lack of contribution to legal sales, the way in which it enables the illicit market in other states, and also the way it symbolically, turns other states off of legalizing cannabis. I'm thinking here of Arkansas's, sort of campaign against its adult use cannabis ballot measure by saying, don't California our Arkansas. So that's the unfortunate state of where California cannabis is. We can talk through why, but I don't think, anyone can shade the truth on where we are today.
No, I appreciate the unvarnished, somewhat dispiriting, perhaps heavily dispiriting view. I think also it's interesting to note, so many people were excited by California legalizing and then disappointed. And I would say subsequent to that, the number one excitement kind of catalyst was around New York. And that's also been extremely disappointing. And then to your point, Hirsh, these smaller states in the meantime have done a pretty much bang up job in many respects in terms of the rollout. I'd be interested to hear from both of you why you think the two biggest states got it so wrong and haven't been able to correct.
Well, I think it's important to define what getting it wrong means. Like my personal perspective would be to take an approach that Hirsh just did, right? So looking at the numbers, what's the economic outlook of the legal marketplace? And by that measure in New York, it has definitely been disappointing, objectively speaking. So that's one way of looking at it. To give some grace to the regulators and the decision makers, or just try to make their argument for them, I think they're looking at it, the success of their program, from a very different metric. And they've been very clear and consistent about that here in New York. So the regulator, the governor, the legislative leaders have all said from the beginning that they're prioritizing a rollout here in the state that's looking at the diversity of ownership of licenses and the social equity opportunities for businesses to launch the program. And that's how they're measuring success. They're not looking at, for example, the tax revenue coming in the door or the amount of sales generated in the legal market as a benchmark of success. And I think there's a fair amount of criticism in not looking at the economic numbers as the measurement of success, but that's just not what the regulators here are doing. So I just want to call that out for what it is.
If I may, I mean, I know you have more to say, and I know that might not be inherently your point, but as long as the point's being made, and to your point that maybe they should be more holistically looking at the economic picture, isn't kind of the limitation, even though they're trying to, provide licenses for more social equity applicants, the fact that so few licenses have been given out, isn't that kind of reflective of the fact that it's simply, economically speaking, it just straight economics, there's no way that there's enough people getting the licenses to make that, even if that's your only definition of success, that a success.
Absolutely. Completely agree. So if you're just straight up looking at kind of, we're here we are 3 years out from legalization, how many licenses are out the door, how many businesses are functioning, that would also, I think, be a very disappointing analysis to do here in New York. And part of that story is related to litigation and an injunction. But that's not the full story. And the other part of that story, I think, is a set of regulations and rules and a licensing process that is unnecessarily complicated and over-engineered and has failed to convert the legacy market to the legal market, and in fact created a void that somewhat of a new phenomenon, right, has happened here in New York, and we call it the illicit kind of pop-up market. It is brick and mortar stores that are unlicensed that are just everywhere, and depending on what you read or who you ask, it's anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 of these illicit market pop-up shops statewide. And that is now the number one problem and impediment to a successful adult use launch here in New York.
Obviously I'm sitting here in California and Katie has the deeper expertise, but from where I sit, a lot of these challenges that exist in California are similar to the challenges that exist in New York. And from the perspective of a Californian, what I've been watching in New York seems like a sort of repetition of a lot of the mistakes we've made in California. And so can get to that in a second. But to focus on California initially, I think there are two primary drivers of the challenges we have here. I think a lot of your listeners are familiar with this. And so maybe later in the conversation, we can talk about why these continue to be challenges and why years later we have not solved these challenges. But what are the two primary issues in California? And again, I think a lot of this is applicable to New York. It is the tax structure and it is the lack of legal retail options. So on the tax structure, I mean, California, when you really dig in and do the math, taxes cannabis more than any other state. Now, why do I say that? One, taxes are not capped at the local level. I think it's notable that in other, even blue states like Massachusetts and New Jersey, they have a 3%, say cap on local retail taxes. There's no such cap in California. And so it is routine for cities like LA to tax cannabis at a 10% rate. So that's really problematic. There's also the 15% state excise tax, which is problematic and quite high. And then just the mechanics and the way that taxes are calculated in California is very problematic. These taxes compound on one another, a practice that is honestly illegal in most other contexts and in industries. But the state tax is applied on an amount that is inclusive of, sort of the local excise tax and vice versa. So it's not merely the number of taxes, but the ways in which they're calculated that makes it very difficult to run a legal cannabis business in California. And then the second challenge is just the lack of retail options. Again, something that, I think California shares in common with New York. And just to dive into the numbers, there are 1,200 dispensaries in California. I think many listeners may know that on a per capita basis, California needs 4,000, 5,000 dispensaries to serve the legal market. So it's really simple. There's a lack of retail options. And perhaps making that problem even worse, the retail options that do exist are concentrated into very narrow segments of the state. So there's about 500 cities in California. 7 of those cities account for almost half of the dispensaries in the state, which is really remarkable if you think about it, right? Cities like, Los Angeles and San Francisco and, Palm Springs, Santa Rosa, they account for almost half of those dispensaries. So that's the problem. And I would say there's a couple of subsidiary causes. One of these is local control. And so in California, cities have the ability to ban cannabis businesses. So you have a small group of cities that very enthusiastically continue to license cannabis businesses more than the market can support. And so it's very problematic. And then you have huge swaths of the state that lack that lack access to cannabis. And so that is one of the main issues. And then maybe the second issue I will say is because the California market is so challenged, it has diminished the incentive of new cities to opt into cannabis. And I mean, everything from the really astonishing rate at which cannabis facilities are robbed in California. I have some clients who had individual facilities that were robbed 10 times in Oakland last year. So things like that. And the fact that many of these businesses aren't able to sustain themselves. And so the cities aren't obtaining the tax revenue that they anticipated. And so I think the point there is that, we're kind of in a very negative spiral here in California where cities don't feel the need to opt in because they look at what is happening in neighboring cities around them. And so, yeah, those I would say are the two causes in California. And I'll just kind of conclude by saying I think many of those same challenges exist in New York.
Where do you each see the solution coming from? Is it just kind of putting, the regulators continuing to put their feet to the fire? Because Hirsh, we've been talking for a few years, and a lot of these problems, are still evident and still happening. And to the taxation point, that's something that's being bandied about now in New York, a new tax. I guess how do you see the problems being stemmed, if not solved completely?
Yeah, I'm going to be very honest here. I take Katie's point about giving grace to the regulators, but I think it's important for us to be honest, at least about what's happening in California. So why has the tax issue not been solved in California? The reason it hasn't been solved is that you have a California state legislature that, is sort of captured by special interests and is indifferent to the fate of the legal cannabis industry. And I know this is an investing podcast, not a political podcast, but I think many of us know in cannabis by now that the political environment affects the state of the cannabis industry. And so, I mean, just to be very specific, last year in California, a bill that we sponsored, SB 512, that would have eliminated this practice of compounding. Now, keep in mind, this wouldn't have lowered the tax rates, but it would have said, hey, you can't tax on top of a tax, right? That bill, SB 512, failed because it couldn't garner support in the state legislature. And I think when even a modest bill like that fails in the legislature, you have to acknowledge that you have a legislature that is not really invested in the success of the cannabis industry and more just sees it as kind of a piggy bank for the other interest groups, right, that sort of ensure their reelection. So I think that's one of the challenges. And I think you also have a department, the Department of Cannabis Control, that primarily sees itself as a kind of political arm of the Newsom administration to advance his interests rather than serve the interests of Californians. And I think just since we're talking about the tax issue in California, one thing that I think everyone listening should look into is the lawsuit in California that was recently filed by Catalyst that alleges quite credibly that the CDTFA is sort of willfully misapplying taxes in California. And I'll give a brief summary of this issue. I think we could do an entire podcast on it. But basically, a lawsuit has been filed in California about the taxability of cannabis accessories. And the CDTFA, which is the sort of tax agency in California, previously said, hey, all of the other component parts that go into a finished good, say the hardware of a vape, should not be taxed. Only the cannabis goods, rather than cannabis accessories, have been taxed. But now that California is facing an immense budget deficit, there has been political pressure on them to revise that interpretation without going through the normal administrative process that they're bound to. So I point this all out to say, if we're going to have an honest conversation about how we address the tax challenges in California, I think we have to look at the behavior of some of the regulators. And, many of them are under legal scrutiny for their failure to take action here. And I would just kind of conclude by saying, as I look across the country, I see a lot of these tax battles being won through the courts, right? If I look to the state of Massachusetts, right, we can see how, they have been able to eliminate, the sort of impact fees in Massachusetts by going to court, by saying that local governments were abusing their tax authority. If I look at the David Boies case at the federal level, because the legislature has failed us at the federal level, you see a action, through the courts to try to mitigate the 280E tax penalty. And so, on the tax point specifically, I think, any reasonable observer would say that the way that this problem is going to be solved is not by engaging with legislators. And I say this as someone who, for the past 6 years has spent most of their time trying to play the inside game to sort of, work your way through the system and sort of convince those in power that they should take a different tack. And I don't have much to show for that. And so I think anyone looking at California should reasonably look at other options to sort of change the punitive and oppressive tax environment that exists. And I can think of no better example than that case that I just mentioned.
It is hard to fight the power. Katie, happy to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I hope that every decision maker in New York is listening to this podcast and listening to Hirsh and kind of the story of California, because I feel like that's exactly where we're going here. And it's been kind of the story of New York is a bunch of different stakeholders saying to the decision makers, look at what's happening over on the West Coast. Don't do this. Don't do that. Think about this. Think about that. And instead of heeding that advice, we're just kind of birds flying into glass windows and they're just going down the path they're going. And, to that end, to Hirsch's point, we're on a different end of the spectrum on the tax story here in New York, where we have on the adult use side, we have a distribution tax that's a potency tax. So it varies based on the potency and the product form. And then there is a point of sale excise tax at retail as well. So it's a 9% excise tax, a 4% local tax at retail, and then your potency tax at distribution. And that's been pretty complicated and unworkable, even just for the conditional rollout that we have to date. And so there is a proposal that's live in the governor's proposed budget, which was released just about a week or two ago, that would basically repeal and replace the potency distribution tax. So it would get rid of the potency component, but it keeps the distribution tax, sets it at 9%. That gets a little bit more complicated if you're one of the few vertically integrated operators in the adult use space. But generally speaking, that's the proposal. And I do think that there is wide consensus that is still just far too high of a tax and not going to result in affordable products that will convert those consumers from illicit market, legacy market over to the regulated channels. And all these issues kind of compound and snowball, and you can hear that in the California story when Hirsh is talking about the challenges. And right away, when Hirsh said the two main issues or big headlines in California, number one being taxes, a big issue in California. I think that's a big issue in New York. They're complicated and they're high. And the second issue Hirsh called out for California was the lack of access to regulated retail. Same story here in New York. And it creates a situation where consumers have more convenient, more affordable options than the regulated channels.
I'm just going to say on Katie's point, she was talking about the tax issues in New York, and I've been following this from California. And here's my take. Hopefully, this isn't too cynical, but I think it's good that New York is having a conversation about replacing the potency tax, and there seems to be a lot of momentum there. But as I read about the new tax structure that was proposed by the governor, and I know this can get revised before it's finalized, it seems to be replaced in part by a wholesale tax on the producers, a 9% wholesale tax, and they have to pay this tax when they deliver product to retailers in New York. But we are already reading stories about retailers in New York being unable to pay their bills. And again, just from the vantage point of California, we have seen how this liquidity issue can cripple an entire ecosystem. Herbal, the biggest distributor in California, collapsed because of these liquidity issues, because there wasn't a lot of cash flow. And it's really concerning that you have all of these producers that are already on a lifeline because no stores have opened, who will be responsible for remitting this product right upon delivery. And when retailers have 30 days or are not even paying those bills on time, that instability can ripple through the system. And so, obviously I'm sitting here in California. I'm sure there are nuances I'm unaware of, but I think a much more workable structure would be the one that was proposed by Senator Cooney, which is just a low excise tax and doesn't create those same kind of cash flow issues. And I'll just say again, this is an ecosystem. When there is instability in one part of this ecosystem, it can ripple through the entire ecosystem. And we've seen how devastating that was in California. I believe we've already seen that in New York. And I would hope the new tax regime does not contribute to that, as was the case in California.
Here, here.
Katie, happy for you to respond or cheer it on.
I completely agree. I think the ideal situation from a lot of different stakeholder perspectives here in New York would be to get rid of that wholesale or distribution tax and just have one point of sale tax at retail. That seems to be a non-starter for the regulator, for the tax department, for the governor's office. And so short of that being the outcome, I would agree with Hirsh that Senator Cooney and Majority Leader Peoples-Stokes have a stronger counter proposal, which would basically be a 2 or 3% whole excise tax at wholesale or at the point of distribution. And I also think the processors in New York will throw down a tax credit proposal on the table that would make that essentially just a paper transaction, but not actually have to pay it. So we'll see where it lands.
Just as we're talking about unworkable tax regimes, I guess I just want to comment on the irony of this at this moment in history from a Californian's perspective, right? So in 1996, California was the first state to pass a medical cannabis law, Prop 215. California gave birth to the idea of cannabis as medicine, coming out of just the awful HIV crisis in California and across the country at that time. So, obviously we all know that the HHS letter was recently released, which was the federal government, for the first time in 50 years, saying that cannabis has medical value. If anyone should be celebrating this announcement, it's California. California is so often maligned by the rest of the country, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. But this is a moment in which California should be able to claim credit, for advancing the idea of cannabis as medicine. But it continues to tax cannabis as a vice, right? And it continues to see cannabis as a cash cow. Katie was talking earlier about how, tax revenue isn't the only goal here. I will say California is different than other blue states, unlike Maryland or Minnesota or some of these other blue states that have recently legalized and have said, hey, collecting tax revenue isn't the goal here. California continues to see the cannabis industry just as a mechanism for revenue generation. And so I just think there's a profound irony in the fact that the rest of the country is now catching up to this movement that California started and should be proud of. And yet in the current implementation of its regime, California is betraying that basic principle that cannabis is medicine and is treating cannabis like a vice, which I think is really unfortunate.
Do you each feel that there's a sort of inherent advantage to being a smaller state? They don't have to kind of like to the point of what New York is trying to stand for, and I wholly applaud what they're trying to stand for. And like, are they caught up by having to try to stand for something that they can't live up to? And to California, is it just too big, and is there too much kind of temptation to take advantage of that? Is there some kind of advantage to being a smaller state that can be more nimble and doesn't have to kind of answer for so many things, or is that not necessarily it?
I think it depends. It depends on the perspective, and again, kind of zooming out for the goal. So, if the goal is to create an emerging legal marketplace that functions, where you can run a viable, sustainable, ideally profitable business and make a living, while generating some tax revenue for the state and destigmatizing a plant that now clearly, has medicinal benefits and is far less addictive and damaging to society than many other substances or activities that we allow and regulate. Yeah, I think the smaller states have a more straightforward line to accomplish that goal. If the goal is to be more focused on the social justice components and reasons behind legalizing, I do think it ups the ante on how challenging rolling out a viable marketplace is and can be for any variety of reasons, but just the inconsistency between state law and federal law, and the fact that you're designing a marketplace that traffics a Schedule I controlled substance, that's a massive hurdle to account for. And I think New York and California are stories where you can see how complicated that can get.
Yeah, and here's what I would say from the perspective of California. If I wanted to be, if we wanted to be fair to California and to cut it some slack, we would say the following. I'll explain later why I don't think those arguments carry water. But if we wanted to be fair to California, we would say, hey, local control is embedded in California's DNA. California is more a nation than it is a state on many issues. Local control is embedded into just the political calculus of Californians. And we were just discussing how local control is one of the reasons that California's market continues to be challenged. So yeah, that's tough, right? There's a lot of autonomy that cities have in the state, so it's harder for state decision makers to push them, right? If we also wanted to be fair to California, we would say, hey, they passed adult use by a ballot initiative, and ballot initiatives per California law are really difficult to modify. They require a supermajority in the legislature or another ballot initiative. And so the ability to tinker and make small changes is more difficult in California. Right? If we wanted to be fair to California, we would say, hey, there are a bunch of competing interests in California. Any political, politician that wants to hold office has to appease dozens of different interests that are competing for their attention. So yes, if we wanted to be fair to California, we would sort of outline all of those challenges. But I don't think those arguments ultimately carry water, right? Although local control exists, there has been next to no guidance that the state has provided to local jurisdictions on how they could develop a workable cannabis program. And so there are cities that don't opt into cannabis sales because they don't have the resources to have their staff do a year of research on different programs that exist out there. Little simple things like that would preserve the autonomy of cities, but incentivize them to adopt retail ordinances would be meaningful. Or, where California has issued grant money to encourage people to adopt retail ordinances, there's often no accountability on how that money is spent by local governments. They're often used sort of as slush funds. So, there has just been a failure of implementation on the local level. On the tax issue, yeah, it's hard to modify a tax structure that was codified by state ballot initiative. But if the governor was willing to invest his political capital in lowering those tax rates and ensuring this industry was successful, then they would be able to get something passed. But the last opportunity the governor had to sort of propose a modified tax structure, he actually proposed an increase in the excise tax rate and only sort of went back down, to 15%. As opposed to the proposal of 19% after negotiations with the legislature. And then there are these interest groups that receive money from California cannabis tax revenue, right? So there are different groups that have political clout that receive a certain amount of tax revenue, right, from cannabis taxes, and that makes modifying that tax structure more difficult. But again, the irony is tax revenues in California continue to decline because of the fractured state of the market, meaning that these interest groups that wanted to receive this money aren't actually receiving that money. So, per Michigan, per Illinois, there is a different way to organize this market and generate the record tax receipts that you are expecting here. There's just been a failure, like a sort of willful ignorance of the economic laws of gravity in California. And while you can give policymakers some grace, I think you also have to use common sense as well. And yeah.
You both worked for different MSOs in government affairs. I'm curious where you stand today. And, frustration is real and people are fallible and people are problematic or they can be. What's your feeling about kind of trying to push regulators or push the law to work better? How hopeful are you and how much have you come up against the harsh light of reality?
Well, I'll jump in. So I am a registered lobbyist here in New York. So that is my job, to try to engage and convince them to move needles, big and small. And so I will forever be an optimist that advocacy efforts to make things better, whether it's tweaking around the edges or more comprehensive reforms, like the effort to get rid of the potency distribution tax here in New York, can succeed. But it is at times thankless, and especially in the cannabis space, right? It's I think I jumped in 2017, 2018, and so I'm definitely newer to the space than many with experience out in the West Coast. But it's hard work, and nothing happens fast.
We see so much evidence of, what's the word? I guess dysfunction is a good word. Canceled meetings and unclear strategies for the meetings. What's your kind of ground level take on that? Is that part of this kind of business, or is what we're seeing as dysfunctional as it seems?
It is as dysfunctional as it seems. And while I will give a lot of grace to the regulators and the decision makers here in New York when it comes to policy objectives, I will not give them any grace when it comes to functionality. And so, it's objectively messy here in New York, and they need to get their house in order. They need to function as a government agency, as a regulator. There's a way to behave. There's a way not to behave. There's a way to conduct business and deal with regulated entities, and there's a way that's unacceptable. And I think that in New York, what's happened lately, and whether it's the anecdotal issues that's kind of among the chatter and gossip of stakeholders, or what went down in the public meeting on December 29th, it's unacceptable. And I have no doubt that they will be working very quickly to fix the governance issues that we have here in New York.
Would you attribute it to something? Like, would you attribute it to the to a problematic makeup of the laws and there's frustration? Or is it politics? Is it nasty politics? Is it kind of this, stigmatized plant that they're trying to get to market? Would you attribute it to something, or?
A combination of all of the above. I think there's some inexperience. I think that it's a very difficult and challenging subject matter and industry. And I think that there's no North Star. So there's no other state that is a perfect example of what New York is trying to do. And so there will, of course, be disagreements and heated debates, and everything's a case of first impression right now. But that said, there is a way that a regulator needs to conduct its business and its mission. And at the end of the day, the politics do need to subside to that core kind of objective regulatory purpose. And that I think is what needs to happen here in New York.
Hirsh, happy for you to share how frustrated you are these days. No, just kidding.
I just think it's a philosophical matter. Regulators, they work for the taxpayers. They work for us, right? Regulators are not primarily political figures. They work for the public. And, if you're being paid $200,000, right, to serve in a regulatory position, it is I don't think it's asking too, it's not asking too much to say that you should be accountable to the public. And I think it's dispiriting sometimes when you see regulators that are, more fixated on identifying perceived boogeymen, right, than doing their jobs. When you go on diatribes about predatory investors and predatory landlords, and look, let's be clear, any form of predatory behavior is unacceptable. But it kind of begs the question, who created the environment that allowed for these predatory investors, right? That made this an uninvestable industry. Who passed the real estate, and zoning restrictions that limited the number of properties that existed that gave rise to predatory landlords? And so I just think it's important to remember that these regulators work for us, they work for the public, and they should be held accountable. It's a privilege to work for the public. And again, I think it's really dispiriting when, for example, just sitting here in California, I read a letter from a bunch of card licensees that are signed anonymously because of fear of retribution from the regulators. It's hard to square some theory of social justice with the idea that citizens in this country should be afraid to speak up. That doesn't sound like justice to me.
Yeah. Everybody let out a big sigh wherever you are.
Yes, I can't agree with that more, to be honest. Just the funny business of potential retaliation or inconsistent treatment among applicants or types of licensees is just it's amateur hour, it's completely inappropriate, and it absolutely needs to stop.
I think about what are the two primary responsibilities of a regulator. I mean, this is what I think. Maybe there are others, right? But it's to ensure the public safety and public health, right, of citizens, right? And it's to provide an accurate window into the state of the market, right? There's the different licensing sort of stats that exist. And again, in California, it's hard to see how any of these objectives have been met, right? I mean, I would point you to the rampant illicit market that continues to sell tainted products, or recent articles like the article that just came out in SF Gate that showed that the Department of Cannabis Control allowed a product to be sold that knowingly was sort of like recalled and had pesticides. That's the kind of thing that sort of undermines confidence in these different regulatory bodies. And the second thing I would say is, talk to any cannabis reporter in California and ask them if they've been able to get accurate information from the department on the state of its licensing. Ask them if, when they've reported the deep licensing errors in the database, what kind of response they've received. And when a regulator seems uninterested in fulfilling those two basic obligations, I don't think it's unreasonable for citizens, whether they work in the cannabis industry or not, to start asking questions about who they are really serving.
Yeah. I'm interested what maybe top few things you would like to see happen, either where you're coming from in your home state or elsewhere.
I'd love New York to just take a step back and reset to focus on the basics. So building that trust with the consumer, with the applicants, with the licensees. I would like to see the regulator kind of communicate a roadmap, if you will, for what they intend to accomplish or tackle in 2024. And then try to stick to the timelines or the deadlines and the goals or objectives that they outline. And I think that would help manage expectations for your various stakeholders here in the state. I think it would allow people who are trying to build and launch businesses to do some basic business planning, and proceed accordingly. I think a big issue here in New York is that inconsistent information or timelines change or decisions get made to go in one direction and then and then they get changed, and so the policy changes when you're kind of halfway through the process. Those things really are detrimental to your everyday people who are looking at the market opportunity or the business opportunity or the investment opportunity and trying to assess if they want to dive in or not. And that ultimately is going to hurt the rollout here in New York. So I honestly I would love to see just a simplification and a roadmap plan from the regulator communicated to the public for what they hope to accomplish in 2024. And then let's just stick to the timeline. Let's stick to the plan.
Yeah, I'll tell you on what I'm focused on in California, and then the other exciting things outside of California, because I think there are really exciting things happening across the country that we should elevate. But in California, what I'm focused on is one, reform at the local level. We've been working, over the past year to get local jurisdictions to cut their taxes. Again, in California, local taxes are not capped, unlike in pretty much every other state. And a lot of these local jurisdictions are forced with the choice of like, hey, I could cut these taxes in half, or this business could disappear. So it's unfortunate. Many of them have planned their budgets around this tax revenue, but we're having conversations that incrementally are successful in lowering the tax burden at the local level. At the state level, as I just mentioned, I don't think any fair-minded person can say, hey, there is a path towards solving the tax issue with the state legislature. There's just not the support there. And so I think there we have to pursue other avenues. And again, I would point you to that case that was brought by Catalyst against the CDTFA that I think will get a lot of attention this year, sort of challenging them both on process and on substance. So I think that's a judicial angle to solve the tax issue. And the other thing that many of us are working on is a potential 2026 ballot initiative that would reduce taxes in California. Now, the problem is to run a campaign at the state level in California, a ballot initiative, it costs $100 million. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people in California cannabis that have that kind of money. And so those are what we're focused on, given that the legislature seems indifferent to the legal cannabis market. So that's sort of the hard work that's in front of us in California. I know much of this conversation has been less than positive, but I guess I do want to say what makes me optimistic, what excites me is all of this cool stuff that's happening in all these other parts of the country. And I think it's our responsibility to elevate these examples, right? It's very exciting that in Minnesota, cannabis access is robust, at least through beverages, and that you can go into, a pizza restaurant, right? And instead of having a beer, you can have a cannabis beverage. Things like that are exciting. They show that when you serve a cannabis beverage at a brewery, the sky doesn't fall. And those are the policy lessons that we can export to other states to increase access. Or it's very exciting, for example, that Mississippi, one of the most conservative states in the country, has the fastest growing medical program in history. And, less than a year after sales started, more than 30,000 people, 35,000 people, more than 1% of the state is registered, and that'll hit 2% by the end of the year. And there are more dispensaries in Mississippi than, the rest of the Deep South, Florida side combined, right? That's really exciting that in the most conservative part of America, we have an open cannabis regime and people are responding to it. It's very exciting in Missouri that you can see and smell the product before buying it, and that there are drive-throughs, and that the tax structure is very low. It's very exciting that in at least half of the 24 adult use states, December 2023 saw total sales records. And so I think California and New York are immensely challenged. And, there's a lot of hard work we have to do to fix those challenges. But part of it is showing that other states have taken a different tack and the sky hasn't fallen, and they have, robust industries. And ironically, California and New York are probably going to have to play catch up with the rest of middle America and figure out a rational way to regulate this plant that we all know is so valuable and profound.
Do you each feel that California and New York are taking some of the necessary lessons? And the B part of that question is, do you feel investment wise, do you feel the landscape getting more fertile for companies, either publicly traded or smaller companies? And I mean specifically in New York and California when I ask that in terms of the investment opportunities, because so many companies have either had to leave California or not been able to get started in New York. Katie, happy for you to take that first.
To be honest, I think the New York market may be a little paralyzed from an investment perspective for the foreseeable future, for one big reason. One is that, and this again could be a whole podcast, but New York is setting up its market in a very strict 2-tier way. And so they have a very complicated true party of interest rule here in New York. And there is a brick wall between retailers and then supply side licensees. And that is extraterritorial in regards to your retailers. So in other words, if you have any interest whatsoever in a cultivation processor distributor outside of New York, you cannot have any interest whatsoever in the retail tier in New York. And so I think that that's going to have a little bit of a paralysis on people putting in some money in New York because they've got to get their head around those TPI rules. And beyond that, the level of disclosure and information that needs to be submitted to the state when you are a true party of interest is very intense and burdensome. And so I think a lot of those things need to work themselves out. A lot of those barriers to entry need to come down a little bit. And I do think that that will happen, but I think it's going to take a couple of years.
And on California, I mean, to answer your first question, do I see any signs that the state is consciously changing their approach? No, I don't see any signs of that in the near future, unfortunately. On your second question about the investability in these states, particularly in California, the irony is, the harsh regulatory climate in California has created a lot of distressed assets. So in many ways, not MSOs necessarily, but a lot of other operators are using this opportunity to pick up these assets on the cheap and scale. And so the irony is, California said it wanted to support small businesses, but a lot of these mom and pop operators are folding and are being picked up by larger operators that are scaling. And so its policy choices are going to create an industry that is ripe for investment, right? But for a narrow group of parties. And that was sort of the opposite of what they intended to do. And I think over time, as these parties gain more power, they will have the political and economic clout to make the regulatory environment more favorable. And so, again, the profound irony is there was a desire to create a diverse industry, yet the regulatory climate made it impossible for those without immense amounts of capital to succeed. And in turn, it will facilitate a consolidation. And the operators that will reap the benefit of that consolidation are the well-capitalized operators. And so there's a lot of people who have been working in this market for a decade, right, that feel cheated because they're not going to be there to see the more normalized regulatory environment.
Yeah. Katie, do you think that there's anyone in New York, any player, any type of company, anybody that's kind of happy with what's happening?
Mm-hmm. Not right now. No, I think the honest answer to that question is no. And I do work with clients across the spectrum of different license types, sizes, and no one is happy at the moment.
Which sometimes you say is the sign of a good compromise, but I think maybe not in this case. Who do you think might be the first kind of group to be happy, for lack of a better term?
For New York, I mean, at the moment, it's your illicit operators, right? So if you've done an assessment of risk and decided to jump in the unlicensed market, you are very successful right now and probably happy with the level of dysfunction, debate, fighting that's going on at the moment. And I think that they're going to be the winners for some time, right? It's just going to take time to get these licenses out the door and get the businesses up and running and really focus on converting consumers. I think it's going to take some time for the environment here in New York to be attractive to consumers, to convert those consumers from those unregulated channels to the regulated channels. And that is absolutely critical to have a successful and viable and ideally profitable business environment.
Yeah, it's really quite crazy what's happening. Just quickly, happy for you each to share your last word, anything you'd like to share with our audience or feel like we may be left out of the conversation. I'm also just curious if you each have an opinion on the David Boies case and what that may lead to.
Sure. So on the David Boies case, I think it's really exciting. What I would say is, any legal analyst would say that its chances of success are slim, just because you have to get all the way up to the Supreme Court. But I think they're advancing a very novel and credible argument that aligns closely with Justice Thomas's concurrence in standing akimbo. I think it highlights a basic truth about the industry, that the federal government has a half in, half out approach to cannabis, and it can no longer retain those kind of police powers if it's given them up. And so, although I think its chances of success are slim, just kind of procedurally, I think they're advancing a very thoughtful argument. And maybe most importantly, right, every one of the Supreme Court justices knows knows David Boies's name. And so having him on your side enhances credibility. And I would say, many movements in American history require pressure, both from the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Like we can go back to the civil rights movement and talk about Brown versus Board of Education and Truman's desegregation of the military, right, and the Civil Rights Act, and see how these things coalesce with one another. And so that would be my thought on David Boies. I think it'll be an uphill climb, but I think I really applaud the people that have sort of are spearheading this lawsuit, and I think that will lead ultimately to the end of prohibition as a contributing cause. And I guess my final thought, as you noted, Rena, is just a simple one. I think it's important for all of us to be honest about what's going on in these markets. And I think there has been a tendency for some people in the cannabis industry to be less than honest, and I guess what I mean by that is I have many friends that work for large California cannabis operators, and they'll say one thing in public about the regulators and another thing in private because they're worried about retribution. I think that ultimately does damage to all of us. And so whether you're an advocate, right, that serves these companies, or whether you're one of these companies, like I think now is the time to be honest about what we're seeing in this idea that kind of like cozying up to the regulators will gain you some favors in the future, I think is both inaccurate and also prevents us from solving the challenges we see in front of us. So we should all just start being honest about what's happening. And again, if someone is being paid more than $200,000 to serve in a regulatory position, I don't think it's asking too much that, that the people that they work for, in the American tradition, sort of provide them with much needed feedback.
I agree with that. I think brutal honesty and authentic engagement with these decision makers is absolutely necessary to accomplish meaningful change or try to push these programs in better directions that make more sense for any stakeholder. And I think you're starting to see that happen in New York with stakeholders getting a little bit bolder to speak their mind or be critical. And you're certainly seeing that with our New York State legislature, who's starting to tune in and educate themselves and engage in cannabis policy in a meaningful way, which is a point of optimism and exciting, for me personally and professionally. And so I agree with Hirsh on that point. And on the David Boies question, I agree. It's kind of similar to how I feel every time Congress takes a vote on a cannabis bill. It's unlikely for Congress to get its act together and actually enact legislation. I think that everyone would agree there's a lot of ground to cover in that regard. But every time there's a vote, generate conversations, get people's attention, and get decision makers at the highest level of the federal government discussing cannabis and the legality of it and how it should be treated by our laws.
Yeah, look, there's clear evidence of this being an imperfect world, and I applaud both of you for trying to make it better. Katie and Hirsh, really appreciate you coming on today. Hirsh, always appreciate you coming on. Katie, hope this is the first of many more conversations that we have. Appreciate you both. If you're a serious investor, here are 3 reasons you should be using Seeking Alpha. We're the only platform with coverage of all significant stocks and ETFs, the only platform providing news, analysis, ratings, and data on stocks and ETFs, and we have the highest quality community of real investors. Find out more at seekingalpha.com/subscriptions. Thanks so much for listening to the Cannabis Investing Podcast. Subscribe or follow us on Seeking Alpha, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. We'd really appreciate it if you left us a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other investors find our show, and it makes us feel fantastic. If you have feedback or questions, we'd love to hear from you at RENA+CANPOD@seekingalpha.com. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice of any sort. And yes, I am still long. Trulieve, Chiron, Issercan Biosciences, the parent company, Air Wellness, and the ETF MSOS. Thanks so much for listening.